Hi guys, since we think Antorus the Burning Throne is the last raid in the expansion, I would now like to review the raids that we have had available in Legion. I'm going to come at this from a heroic raider's point of view, so people who raid Mythic may have a completely different viewpoint than me. I'm also going to look at the raids from more of a tanking perspective, rather than a DPS or healing point of view. So some fights or raids that a DPS or healer may hate, I as a tank might have found enjoyable. This is only my opinion, and I look forward to hearing your views in the comments below. So starting with the Emerald Nightmare, which was the first non-tier raid in Legion which contained 7 bosses. Now I'm going to say right away that I absolutely hated this raid, and I never enjoyed any aspect of this raid at all, which is a real shame, as for the most part I think Blizzard always deliver excellent raids. But in Legion they have been a bit of a mixed bag. So why did I dislike this raid so much? Well, it's simple. For me as a tank, it felt like there was literally nothing to do, or that there was no real threat or urgency on pretty much every boss fight, bar heroic Ursoc, when you actually had to pay attention on judging the 2 different debuffs he would apply, whilst moving the boss around from the stuff he left on the ground. If you did misjudge the debuff, then this would pretty much result in your death. Things like that for me as a tank are quite fun, as it applies some pressure on you not to mess up. But every other boss was very basic, at least from a tanking perspective, and did not require any real focus from the player who was playing the tank. I often found myself just watching YouTube videos or Netflix on my other monitor, and just pressing the relevant buttons when needed. Everything was just so simple, and normally just required a basic taunt swap, with very little movement of any kind, which meant you were just standing in a fixed position for the vast majority of the fight. In other words, I was just completely bored. I don't know of any player that I know of that actually enjoyed this raid. The last boss in this raid was of course Xavius, which again posed no issue for pretty much any organised guild that faced him. I think a lot of the issues for this raid came from the fact that Blizzard were caught out at just how powerful a role artifact power and the constant farming of Mythic Plus dungeons for loot, along with legendaries, would play out in Legion, meaning that when people entered the Emerald Nightmare, they already outgeared it, which is maybe why it felt like none of the bosses posed any real threat, and why the content was cleared so easily. So overall in my opinion, this was by far and away the worst raid in Legion. So moving on to the 3 boss mini raid, which is Trial of Valor, which was the second raid in Legion, and this was a raid that I really enjoyed. However, this raid on Heroic was a big step up in difficulty compared to the Emerald Nightmare, and I think this was possibly overtuned for a number of people, at least at the beginning, as I think Blizzard did not want a repeat of the face roll that Emerald Nightmare turned out to be. So again, from a tanking point of view, this was the complete opposite to the Emerald Nightmare. You had to do everything that you did not have to do in the previous raid. For example, on the first boss, which was Odin, you had to first separate the adds in phase 1 to stop the damage reducing buff they would get, which was nothing special, and then just DPS them down to around 25%. And it was at this point that Odin would drop down and phase 2 would begin. And this is where the fight became fun as a tank, because we actually had something to do. One tank would pick up Odin, whilst the other would pick up one of the adds. And you would rotate the taunt swapping whilst dodging the spears of light that would appear on the ground beneath you, and then dodge the orbs that would appear as the spears exploded in order not to be stunned. Phase 3 was also a lot of fun as a tank, as it required you to position the boss in the correct area of the room, whilst having to really manage your cooldowns, due to the deadly Stormforged spear that would be aimed at the tank. So the constant moving around and dodging of abilities, whilst positioning the boss and being aware of what was going on around you, whilst maintaining your mitigation for the potential one-shot mechanic of the Stormforged spear, felt so much more engaging and challenging than the previous raid. I actually enjoyed all of the fights in this raid. I thought Guam was a really fun boss with a pretty tight DPS check, meaning you were just about killing him before he enraged. But he had relatively simple mechanics that really punished you if you messed up. But as long as you did the mechanics correctly and had the DPS required, was a pretty simple boss in both normal and heroic. Hellier was my least favourite boss, and in my opinion was a pretty difficult boss at the time. Yet I still enjoyed it, and I thought it was very visually impressive, especially in phase 2 when the waves and the ships came across the screen. So overall, bar maybe the Odin fight being a bit too long, I thought this raid was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it. So moving on to the third raid and the first tier raid of the expansion, which contained 10 bosses, which was the Nighthold. Now this raid for me was a truly great raid. First of all, it looked amazing. Instead of almost every raid always looking dark and gloomy, this one looked very grand, with wide open spaces and epic looking scenery, to the point at times you did not actually feel like you were in a raid. I really think designing more visually impressive raids adds to people's enjoyment, so I really hope Blizzard continue to do raids like this. There was a nice step up in difficulty as you progressed through the raid, with various bosses posing their own unique problems, but you were allowed to make mistakes. And yes, you would be punished for not carrying out a mechanic correctly, but you could also recover from those errors. An issue that would become a big problem in the next raid release. There were certain bosses in the Nighthold which were annoying, and not enjoyable for me at least, such as Star Augur and Grand Magistrix Elisande. But other than those, I enjoyed almost every fight. This was also another fun raid as a tank, as the boredom of Emerald Nightmare had now completely been removed, as the bosses were more varied, at least from a tanking perspective. For example, one fight you'd be tanking Crosis, and taunt swapping to manage the Searing Brand debuff, popping a cooldown to help soak the slam, then sprinting away before the bridge collapsed. Then a moment later, you could be on the botanist, constantly moving around and repositioning the boss to avoid the controlled chaos and solar collapse abilities. My point being, you were always involved in the fight. The conclusion to this raid was of course Gul'dan, and I thought it was one of the most enjoyable end bosses to a raid tier, ending with a pretty cool cutscene. So overall, this to me is the best raid in Legion, as I thoroughly enjoyed it. So moving on to the fourth raid and the second tier raid of the expansion, which contained 9 bosses, which was the Tomb of Sagaris. This raid at first was a bit of a pain to navigate until you got to understand the layout. I thought this raid looked okay, but we were once again back to the dark and gloomy colour scheme of previous raids. But I guess it fits in well with the Legion aspect of the game. This raid contains some very unique bosses, like the Maiden of Vigilance and the Fallen Avatar. Having to jump into a hole in the ground when the bomb that was placed on you was about to explode was a very interesting and cool mechanic. Jump in too early and you would fall to your death, but jump in too late and you would deal huge damage to the raid. Again with the Fallen Avatar, as a tank having to control and position the Maiden whilst dealing with all of the abilities going on around you, whilst having to swap between the boss and the Maiden was a unique feeling. Bursting through the floor going into phase 2 was awesome, especially the first time seeing it, to which it then became a pure DPS race in killing the boss. I think my favourite fight though was Mistress Sazine, as there was just so much stuff going on, and I love those kind of fights. Making sure you're on point with the taunting for Burden of Pain, otherwise you're going to start nuking your raid. Dodging the tornadoes and the crashing waves, and of course soaking the Hydra shot. I really enjoy seeing interesting fights like this. However, this was a very divisive raid, as some people really enjoyed it and other people really hated it. I myself actually enjoyed it. I thought it was a very good raid. However, it was a very frustrating raid for a couple of reasons, and they were pretty big and problematic reasons. Reason number 1 was there were way too many soak and split raid damage requirements. Pretty much every single boss in the raid required you to always soak or split some form of damage at some point. It got to the point where the raid became a bit of a meme and was referred to as the Tomb of Soak Agaris. Having so many soak or split damage requirements throughout the raid made the fights feel more of the same and less unique than they should have been. But the biggest issue was probably reason number 2. In the Nighthold I mentioned that you would be punished for not carrying out mechanics or making errors on the boss fights, but you could recover from them. But in the Tomb of Sagaris, this took this to a whole new level. This was due to too many one-shot mechanics that could potentially wipe a raid. Now this is less of a problem for an organised guild containing skilled players, and I don't mean that to come across in a bad or arrogant way. But what I mean is, for a lot of guilds they have a mixture of players. Some may be very good players, and some may not be as good as others, and this can especially apply to pug groups as well. Now people don't have an issue with one-shot mechanics. If you make a mistake and it kills you, then so be it. But when it is a mechanic that can kill multiple people, or wipe the entire raid, then people become very frustrated, annoyed, and then do have a problem with that. Because if something is killing you as a player that is out of your control, then that is affecting your progression, as you can't do anything about it. The fact that one person could wipe out a raid because they didn't carry out a mechanic, or they made a mistake, got DC'd, or simply hit a lag spike is really unfair. The biggest example of this was on Kil'jaeden. Now Kil'jaeden was not a particularly difficult boss. However, I will just say as a tank that when you first encountered him and he applied fell claws to you, that he hit like an absolute truck. The damage he would deal to you was insane. However, he did have very basic mechanics. Yet if just one person did not do the mechanic and soak an Armageddon for example, then it was pretty much a raid wipe. I mean, how many people have tried Kil'jaeden just on looking for raid, especially in the first week it came out? You just have to see how many people die during the soaking phase. Even to this day, when I sometimes jump into Kil'jaeden for the bonus satchels, which grant artifact power bonus, I still see people ignoring the mechanics and wiping a number of people. So Tomb of Sagaris was a raid where everyone in your group had to be paying attention, and this took its toll on a number of people, and on a number of guilds. Overall, I actually really liked this raid and looked forward to doing it. I don't think it's as good as the Nighthold raid, but it is my second favourite raid in this expansion. So moving on to the 5th raid and the 3rd tier raid, and what we believe to be the final raid in Legion, which contains 11 bosses, which is Antorus, the Burning Throne. So this raid for the most part has a very similar look and feel to the Tomb of Sagaris, in terms of the colour scheme and aesthetics, which makes sense seeing as though we are now assaulting the Legion. I think it has some interesting, unique and cool looking bosses such as Eonar, which plays a bit like a tower defense game, where you have to protect the boss from the incoming adds, and whilst I don't really enjoy that boss, it's still nice to see Blizzard trying something different, and I hope they continue to keep trying things like this in future raids. I really enjoyed the Agromar fight as a tank, having to use a cooldown for the big hit you take from the 4-breaker attack, and then immediately having to turn the boss around to the raid for everyone to soak the Flame Rend attack. I thought that was pretty cool. Another boss I really enjoyed was actually the first boss, Gorothi Worldbreaker, as I thought it was a fun first boss and a good introduction to the raid, plus the fact that I really enjoyed blowing people up with Fell Bombardment who were standing in positions that they should not have been standing in. I'm sure other tanks know what I mean. Portal Keeper, Kin Goroth, and the Antoran High Command were also interesting fights. The last boss of Argus the Unmaker to me was the biggest disappointment. I found this fight kind of boring. I liked the idea of the last phase, and I did think it was a fun ending to the fight, but the phases leading up to this were not for me. The final cutscene was again disappointing. I don't really know what I was expecting, but I was hoping to see something a little more epic than what occurred. Overall, I do think Antorus is a pretty fun raid, with some nice boss fights. I think this raid is in no way as punishing as the Tomb of Sagaris, due to there being no real deadly raid wipe mechanics, but it's also a raid that has some issues. I do think it suffers from the problem that the Emerald Nightmare had in terms of difficulty, as it's not a very difficult raid. And if this raid has to last people until the next expansion, then we could end up running into issues later on down the line of people having nothing to do. Anyway guys, finally my favourite raids in order were the Nighthold at number 1, closely followed by Tomb of Sagaris at number 2, at number 3 is Antorus the Burning Throne, with Trial of Valor coming in at number 4, and way down the list in last place at number 5 is the Emerald Nightmare. Anyway guys, those were my thoughts on the Legion raids. Let me know your thoughts below. Thanks for watching and please do comment, like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.